So I think that one of the biggest ways we can kind of move forward is try to minimize violence wherever possible. That should always be, I think, the main goal for every government on Earth and every individual on Earth. When we're trying to deal with disputes, do our very best to educate our children that violence should always be the last resort. Yes, there may be some cases when you have to defend yourself, but it should always, always, always be the last resort. And I think if we can get that idea out there at a young level and to all our leaders everywhere to start thinking like that, then maybe we can start defunding the military and putting that money towards peacekeeping and food and eliminating poverty worldwide, all the UN 17 goals that we have. The more military funding we can kind of funnel into sustainable funding and sustainable development funding, I think will kind of, like, every dollar you put into this peacekeeping mission, might pay off $10 of military money you don't need, because people don't need to fight back. They don't need to become terrorists because they're well fed and they're well educated and they have opportunities. So does that make sense?
Well, as always, I like your optimism always. It's just always everything you say. There's like a whole bunch of issues that are being discussed in political science and political philosophy in the terms of implementation. Because like you can get most people to agree, like with something like the United Nations, which is functionally mostly for like proclamations. It's not really for really doing things in the world, which is why every government in the world tolerates it, because it's not really going to actually do, and like will scold them if they do something
Yeah.
bad, but not really much more. Which is, but that also that means that that's why it can exist,
Okay.
because it's not that much of a bother to anybody with the military that they would want to stop it, and at least for show would like to keep it existing and participating in it so that they can maintain appearance at least of
Right.
trying to resolve things diplomatically. So, but the issue is there are like actually a few. One of the angles is what to do with militaries. It's like sort of bit in the vein of defund the police movement,
Hmm.
because what it means ultimately, if you say like defund it, then like well, the people on the especially right end of the political spectrum would oppose it immediately by saying like, but then of course like the bad guys will come and we won't be able to defend ourselves. But the issue is, what do you mean when you say that? If your idea of it is in any way reasonable, is that it's more about transformation of what it does and what is it for, rather than like that you shouldn't have an army. A good example is uh, actually Star Trek Federation is
Right.
always like the go-to futuristic, because the Starfleet is a military,
Yep.
is a kind of military, but their mission statement is just different. It's not there to pick fights, and not just that. It's not just a standing army in case somebody attacked them to defend either. It proactively, mainly, does a whole host of other things than fighting. It's just armed and capable of fighting if the
Hmm.
situation calls for it. So I actually wrote an article about it on Medium. I forgot what I called it right now, but essentially I wrote about exactly this. An article like the kind of military that I would join,
Hmm.
because I am a pacifist ultimately, and I'm very glad that actually in my country mandatory military service was cancelled for my year of birth as the first one in the
Hmm.
modern Czech Republic. So I was like the first
Really?
year of birth that didn't have to go to have a mandatory military service for any amount of time. Again,
Yeah.
I was very glad about that. But the reason why is that, of course, there's like a lot of bullying and like nonsense, like machoistic nonsense there that doesn't have to be there at all. That can definitely be uh, changed about any military. But also, my problem is with like the mission statement of militaries. Like, if it's a national military, which either will be doing nothing or it will be picking fights for some sort of like territorial gains, then like for me, there's, and I believe for essentially a big part of my generation of people, there's
Hmm.
just nothing in like of interest in that whole concept.
Right.
Because if you are like more of an internationalist or globalist, then there's the danger on the other side of that is one world government type thing. Like if you, okay, so let's have like one world order, one world government, one world military, then it
Yep.
would be really bad if it was still the old kind of military, because then it would be just a kind of totalitarian,
Right.
dystopian
Right.
version of the future, more like in Star Trek, more like Cardassians or like some of the like villain races. So you have to like if you were to move in that direction, that something like United Nations was actually a global military initiative, which of course I guess you could like a prototype of that you can see in international alliances. We have something like NATO, like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that you can see that you can have one military organization that's um, like constituted of different nations or different types of people and parts. It's just some sort of common goal. And NATO, the common goal of NATO was defense against the Eastern Bloc, against the Soviet Union. So in that sense, it's sort of a bit lost, even like the point of why it exists. So if it were to be like in the future, the kind of military that I think would work to actually improve things, it would have to be like Starfleet, and it doesn't have to be like actually flying into space or like about any of the details, though it would be cool. But even on like planet-wise, if you had a force like that, it would mostly be for like humanitarian relief efforts. So something again, a prototype of that, a little bit, but very nerfed, is like the blue helmets of the United Nations. So they have a force of their own like that a little bit. They're supposed to be just neutral and just for like protection during like difficult transitional periods and for relief efforts. So that's part of it. But also like if you, for instance, like it would be like an army, for example, that would be fighting against the climate change. So that would be like a global, essentially military force because it needs to be able to defend itself, but heavily focused like Starfleet on its engineering core and doing massive projects all the time, all over the world, for specifically the benefit of the whole world.
I love it. It's a great idea. So I'd love to talk more about specifically how that could work, how we can kind of think about transitioning eventually all the world militaries to a UN global peacekeeping force similar to Starfleet, if you kind of wanted to say it simply. And like you said, focus on engineering, design, focus on sustainable design, focus on their goal as the worldwide military is to accomplish those 17 SDGs, which have already been established. They're already very well, I think, understood, and the goals are very, very specific. So if you just say this is, even if you were to convert, say, 10% of the world's militaries to just dedicate them all to the UN, they're not loyal to any one nation anymore. They're all part of the UN global peacekeeping force. They can live anywhere in the world. They have maybe passports to every country or something like that, and they can come and go. And the UN, but their purpose is figuring out how to accomplish these 17 sustainable development goals
Yeah.
and how to help keep the peace around those.
Yeah, because they obviously can't go where they're not wanted or
Yeah,
include anybody who doesn't want to be part of it. So the transition is really about it would start small and maybe more would join after they would start seeing results. Because what it would
right.
essentially mean, like for something like geoengineering, you would be required to do massive projects and at that in that case like a part of the issue is that local nations where you have to do this you have to solve it somewhere on the earth so somewhere on earth you have to build something or do something, and of course
Right.
it's like very difficult like in Brazil in the Amazon forest where the local government is very hostile to like trying to save it, even though that is a big issue for the whole world and would be like the example case of where ideally you would want something like okay, so we have to fix this rainforest, so that's where you would send the force there to do various engineering programs, like of course in cooperation with the local government, but like would try to actually do the fixing, and it wouldn't be just like left to Brazil to just fix the Amazon and
Right.
everybody else, because it wouldn't even then necessarily be a problem that you get like a huge funding for militaries if the militaries were using the huge funding to develop things technologically wise, again for the benefit of the all of mankind. It's essentially peaceful technologies that, or well, because that's the thing. If you develop engineering technologies, they will still be beneficial to you in military situations if it's
Right.
like engineering technology. So it's not that it'd be useless. Much like when you have a space program, it's one of the other examples of international cooperation is actually the space program, where
Hmm.
even nations that are in some form of conflict with each other, like Russia and United States, could actually cooperate in that specific scenario, like an international space station or something. So that's again another part of the prototype of how this works, and that's why I think that in science fiction it was actually like a Starfleet, like a space army type.
Yeah.
They call themselves, I think, humanitarian armada is the description that Starfleet uses. So that's, I believe, why these things were connected. Like you connect United Nations and the space program and the concept of military, and what you get is something that I guess you could get to from where we are now. It's just like, it really would does require that, because like in the beginning, like I said with the example of the Velvet Revolution, the only reason why it worked is because sufficient consensus was reached. So in that sense, like we last time discussed fake news, the greatest enemy to being able to achieve any of these solutions is anything that sows discord. Because
Mm.
then you have examples of, like, again, global crises like that should be just solvable in a humanitarian way, like the pandemic, like a global
Right.
pandemic. And you see that all of the powers and factions and platforms that sowed discord among people about like the approach to the crisis, like everybody who was trying to make people believe that it wasn't real, or try to push conspiracy theories that, like, I don't know, there's like 5G chips from Bill Gates in the vaccine and stuff. Like those are
Yeah.
the like real enemies, in a sense that what you need in those situations is effectively to achieve a sufficient level of consensus. For example, about like, okay, we actually have to solve the climate problem planet
Right.
wide, and then on the basis of that consensus, you could start building like a first alliance of existing institutions like
Yeah.
armies and or United Nations, and then like develop them into like a whole broader initiatives of their own that could like sort of become a new thing.